Thanks, Morris. It was quite a dramatic reading, wasn't it? And a disturbing ending with the king of Moab sacrificing his own son on the walls of their capital city, which was probably Dibon. But what's interesting about that story is that there's a version of that story that comes from the non-biblical history. And we're going to have a look at Misha's version of the same story a little bit later on. But for the moment, let's wind the clock forward a little bit from the time of the kings and the Moabites to late winter 1896. And let's go to the temple complex at Luxor in Upper Egypt. It's a little bit confusing because it's in the south of Egypt. And we've got a famous English archaeologist, Flinders Petrie, perhaps the father of modern archaeology, a man that was known for carefully documenting his finds. He's excavating an ancient Egyptian temple, and he comes to a beautiful black granite slab called a stele. It's about 3 metres high, so pretty tall, highly polished on one side and a bit rough on the other. The highly polished side is about King, I won't even bother trying to pronounce his name, but it's actually the polished side of the stele is turned towards the wall by his son, who has written his description of his exploits on the back. This is what sons did to their fathers back in those days. It's covered with hieroglyphs, which are ancient Egyptian writing. And Wilhelm Spiegelberg, a German expert in these things, steps over to translate for Petrie what these hieroglyphs actually mean. And he discovers it is a boastful record of Pharaoh Mereneptah, listing all the people that he's conquered. And he reads through the list and he gets near the bottom of the list and he comes to this very strange name, Isiria. Anybody like to guess what that is? Exactly. Petrie leapt to the solution of what it was while Wilhelm was trying to puzzle out what it might mean. Petrie leaps to the solution. Israel, he says. Won't the reverends be pleased? And they were, because the inscription dated to 1200 BC, talking about 3,000 years ago. And it was the earliest mention, it's the earliest known mention of Israel outside the Bible. Very, very interesting, the context of that and the way in which that was written, because Mereneptah is generally considered to be Pharaoh of the Exodus. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. It's just one of many, many examples when we look at the non-biblical record where non-biblical historical sources substantially agree with the biblical record and demonstrate the uniqueness of the Bible as a historical record. Now, I studied ancient history, as many of you know. It didn't do me a lot of good in my working career, but I did learn a lot about ancient history and I read a lot of ancient sources. And from my experience, and I stand to be corrected, but certainly looking at Western history, I know of no other book from the ancient world that covers such a vast breadth of time as the Bible in such detail and with such reliability. It's rare to find something like this. It really and truly, it really is. That is so credible, that provides so much detail, in-depth detail about what people were thinking and what they were doing, what motivated them, and covering such a huge breadth of history. We're talking about probably in the vicinity of 4,000 years of history. There's just no other ancient source that covers that breadth of history with this sort of level of reliability and detail. The father of history is supposedly Herodotus. I don't know if you've ever read Herodotus, but it makes amusing reading because he just picked up whatever story was around and recorded it. And it covers nothing like this breadth of time. And for me, that's strong evidence of the inspiration of the Bible. But I want to tonight allow the evidence to speak for itself. We're going to have a look at the biblical record from the other side of the fence, as it were. We're going to have a look at biblical events as they were recorded by non-biblical characters and non-biblical records. So as I say, we're talking about 4,000 years of history up to the time of Christ. And at various points in time, the people surrounding Israel, their histories intersected the history of Israel. And you can, you'll know what I'm talking about. So Israel were invaded at various times. They came into contact with other peoples at various times. And those contacts are actually recorded by those ancient people, and we can have a look at them. We're going to have a look at a number of examples of where that contact took place, and we'll compare them with the Bible record. And we won't find perfect agreement, I'll tell you right now. If you're looking for perfect agreement, you won't find it, although we will come very close in a few instances. And that's because, really, there's probably no such thing as a fully truthful and accurate man-made history. And for decades, the job of ancient historians, a lot of them still would go down this path, is to compare history and to analyse it to try to come up with truth. But in the last 20 or 30 years, we've had the onset of the postmodernists who have given up on that idea, and they've said it's unfindable. We can't find the truth. And there's a lot in what they're saying. And I in many ways support them, although it kind of throws the whole practice of history out the window. What's the point if you can't find truth? The postmodernist says, well look, every history, and it wouldn't be a historian alive that wouldn't acknowledge this, every history is written with an agenda. The historian is writing to promote a personal agenda. And an easy example is that the one we've just looked at, Mereneptah, who's written history. His history of his exploits. Now Mereneptah's got an agenda, and that's self-promotion. So often, that's the case with histories. You look at the histories of Alexander the Great, one of the big disputes about that, and the big problems is that one of Alexander the Great's main historians was in his pay. And Alexander had an agenda to show posterity how great he was. So maybe the things we've heard about Alexander aren't exactly true. What was the truth about Alexander? How successful really was he? We don't know. There's no standard of truth except the Bible. So inevitably, what we're going to find when we compare non-biblical historical sources with the Bible, we're going to find differences in detail. The Bible's the standard of accuracy, so the problem is not with the Bible, it's with our non-biblical sources. However, what's really amazing is that as we look tonight at something like 4 different civilisations covering a period of about 2,000 years in various parts of the Middle East, we'll find substantial agreement. Now that's amazing when you take into account the fact that we're looking at different histories written by different people who were not in contact with each other. And to me, that is a really amazing thing, that when you look at the full breadth of the Bible, that you get such, as we'll see, quite amazing agreement between the records. So let's allow the evidence to speak. I'm going to go through a few examples now, and let's survey some examples of where non-biblical sources talk about biblical events, and let's compare them with the Bible. So let's go back in time 3,700 years ago to 1700 BC. So we're talking about roughly the time of Jacob. We're going to go to the Western world's first civilization. And I could ask the children, the school kids here, which civilization that was, and they'd tell you Sumer. And if you were a young lady in Sumer, that's what you might be wearing. I don't know if you find that attractive, young ladies, but that's what they wore. They've excavated that and been able to reconstruct it. So Sumer was located generally from the Persian Gulf up between the 2 rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. So it was the beginning of Mesopotamian civilization. And I want to have a look at this, which is called the Genesis, which is it's cuneiform you can see there, which he had some cuneiform on the screen to begin with. And it's the earliest form of writing. So you can try this at home sometime, grab some mud or some clay, and you can make little wedge-shaped marks. And the writing was a code made up of wedge-shaped marks. And it was, I think, more often than not, intended to be temporary. So, you know, it was like having an exercise book, piece of paper you could write on. So they could make these little cuneiform marks on the clay, and when they wanted to reuse that tablet, they could drop it in some water or wash it off and start again. That's where the excuse came from. You might have heard of it, the dog licked my homework. Yeah. So I haven't got it because the dog licked it and it came off. Well, what happened was, you could make this record permanent either by drying it, or if you dried it you could still wash it off, or by firing it and making it into ceramic. Now you could do that deliberately, you could fire that deliberately, or sometimes what happened, and this is how come we've got so many cuneiform tablets, we'll talk a bit more about them later. So tablet, I don't mean like Aspros or Panadol, I mean a little piece of clay, often only very small, sometimes quite big. The reason why we've got so many of them is that they were stored in libraries, and then when the city burnt down, of course all the cuneiform tablets were fired and became hard and permanent. So we've got a huge number of cuneiform tablets in various collections and museums and private collections all over the world. So this particular one was found at the Sumerian city of Nippur. I'm not sure why it's called the Genesis, because it was found in Nippur, which was a major city in Sumer, and it's found now in the Pennsylvania University. It was found by the Pennsylvania University, and it's located in the Penn Museum. And it's famous for this reason: it contains an early account of the flood. So there it is. Let's just read that out. This is what it says. So it actually goes through a whole Genesis story, a whole creation story. And then it says this: a flood will sweep over the temples to destroy the seed of mankind. It is the decision, the word of the gods, by the word commanded by Anu and Enlil, the two gods. Its kingship, its rule will be put to an end. It's about 40 lines missing. All the windstorms, exceedingly powerful, attacked as one. At the same time, the flood sweeps over the temples. After, for 7 days, the flood had swept over the land, and the huge boat had been tossed about by the windstorms on the great waters. Utu came forth, who sheds light on heaven and earth. King Zeusundra opened a window of the huge boat. Now that's pretty interesting, really, isn't it? I mean, it sounds a bit disjointed because you can see the tablet's got cracks in it and breaks and all sorts of things. So that's the reason why the text is disjointed. But if you're familiar with the story of the flood, and many of you I know are, you'll recognise a lot of similarities there between that story and the flood story. Let's just have a look at a few. So obviously the flood sweeps over the temples, says the tablet. The idea is to destroy the seed of mankind, and it's by the command of the gods. We know from Genesis 6 that it was God's decision to destroy man, whom he created from the face of the earth by the flood. The flood swept over the temples, over the whole land, after for 7 days. Genesis says that it was after 7 days that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. Noah was saved, anyway, the king, Zeusundra, was saved in a huge boat. Noah was saved in the ark. In the end, the king opened a window of the boat. Noah opened a window of the ark. So there's a lot of similarities there. And this is very interesting when it's looked at, because the story comes up again, and it comes up again in the Sumerian king lists, which you've probably heard of. And what's interesting about that is these kings had huge, long reigns. There's a break with the flood, and then the rains actually diminish. Again, exactly the same as what Genesis says. So there were very, very long lifespans, There was a flood, and then the lifespan shortened down. So what we've got again is near perfect agreement. Oh, it's not perfect agreement, I should say, but we've got substantial agreement with the Bible. Obviously, the Sumerians had a memory of the flood carried on by the tradition, a little bit like Chinese whispers. As time went on, that story got distorted. Let's have a look at another example, and let's have a look at the stele that was discovered by Flinders Petrie. So we've moved now 500 years forward to 1200 BC. We've moved in the biblical record from Genesis right through now to roughly the time of Exodus. And this is what he found. So that's the granite slab. I think that's Mereneptah over there on the right. And this is what it says. Again, what it is, it's a slab or a monument describing Mereneptah's conquests. And it goes through a whole list of different nations. And at the bottom, let's have a look at this. We've got this. Ashkelon has been overcome. Giza has been captured. Yanoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste and his seed is not. Haru is become a widow because of Egypt. So there's the mention of Israel in the context of being conquered by Mereneptah. Now what's interesting about this is that Mereneptah is considered by most people to be the pharaoh of the Exodus. So the Israel that Mereneptah knew were wandering people that didn't have a homeland, so they were wandering in the wilderness. And that's exactly how, when you have a close look at this reference to Israel, that's exactly how Mereneptah describes Israel. So here's, can anyone read hieroglyphics? No. Over on the left is the hieroglyph for Ashkelon, and that's the hieroglyph for Israel. And there's a very interesting difference between those two hieroglyphs. So the Ashkelon hieroglyph, we've got the symbol of the throw stick, which means foreign, and then that little wiggly line underneath supposed to represent hills, 3 mountains, which represents a city. So if you put those two together, what's it saying? Ashkelon is a what? Foreign city. Foreign city. However, when we look at Israel, again we've got the throw stick, which means foreign, but instead of 3 mountains, which represent a city, we've got a man and a woman seated, which represents people. So what would this represent? Foreign people, exactly. So you can see the difference. Ashkelon, described as a foreign city. Israel, not described as a city, but as a foreign people. And the Oxford History of the Biblical World says that this was the way in which Egypt referred to nomadic groups of people that did not have a fixed city-state as a home. So the stele of Mereneptah, this very first mention of Israel, which dates back to roughly the time of the Exodus, describes Israel as a nomadic people, which is very interesting because they were never really nomadic after they got into the land of Canaan. So that tends to, again, this is fairly, it's not a detailed agreement, but certainly evidence to support that at the time of Mereneptah, Israel were actually wandering in the wilderness. They were wandering people without a home. Now we know what's interesting about this, of course, is that Mereneptah is saying that he destroyed Israel, and we know from the biblical record that in fact it was the other way around. Mereneptah was actually destroyed, well, he wasn't, but his army was destroyed in the Red Sea. But you think about this is where the agenda takes over, because Mereneptah is not going to come back to his people and record for posterity the fact that he lost an army. He's gone out in pursuit of Israel. His people have seen him go out in pursuit of Israel. He comes back with a much diminished army. What's he going to tell the people? Not that he's been defeated, but that he's defeated Israel in a big battle in which he lost many people. So let's take a look at another example. This is what's called the Moabite Stone. We're moving forward now about 400 years to 840 BC. We're moving to a place called Dibon, which is the capital of ancient Moab. You can see it's over here, just to the east of the Dead Sea. You can see a pretty bad black and white photograph of the ruins of Dibon there in the middle. Fairly colourful story about how this was found. It was found in 1868 by an Anglican missionary. It was the first and last European to see it in one piece, because the Europeans started bidding for it. The Turks, who had control over the territory, tried to obtain the stone from the local Bedouins, and I suppose Bedouins thought it was going to be worth more in many little pieces than in one big piece, so they stuck it on a bonfire, heated it up, threw cold water on it and broke it into bits with boulders. It's the Bedouins for you. But fortunately, copies had been taken of the stele before they actually did this, and so the stele could be reconstructed. They got most of the parts, put it back together again, and they were able to reconstruct it. And it's now in the Louvre in Paris. But what's interesting about it is that it records the exploits of Mesha, king of Moab, that we read about tonight in 2 Kings chapter 3. So let's just refresh our memories by having a look at 2 Kings chapter 3 verses 4 to 5. We read there that Mesha, king of Moab, was the sheep master, and rendered unto the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and 100,000 rams with the wool. But it came to pass, when Ahab was dead, that the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. And of course, we read about how three kings got together. The King Jehoram, the son of Ahab. So Mesha actually rebels against Israel in the time of Ahab. Ahab's son decides to do something about it. He joins up with Jehoshaphat, and he joins up with the king of Edom. They go to fight against Mesha with the intervention of God. They actually have some success. Mesha retreats back into his capital, and there, at his extremities, facing defeat in the face, sacrifices his son on the wall. And outraged, the three kings return to their own land. Pretty horrible story. Well, the Moabite Stone describes this revolt. So this is what it says. I am Mesha, son of Chemosh, the king of Moab, the Dibonite, and I made this high place for Chemosh. Chemosh is the god of the Moabites. As for Omri, the king of Israel, and who was Omri? Father of Ahab. As for Omri, the king of Israel, and he humbled Moab for many years, for Chemosh was angry with his land, and his son reigned in his place, that would be Ahab. And he also said, I will oppress Moab, but I triumphed over him, and Israel has perished. He goes on and on with many, many lines of boasting. I can't fit on the screen and it would bore you. Then another interesting statement, and the house of David dwelt in Haranan. Chemosh said to me, go down and fight against Haranan. I went down and Chemosh restored it in my days. So again, very interesting, because it supports the Bible. Firstly, it's evidence of the existence of Moab, and there wasn't a lot of evidence for the existence of Moab outside the Bible until this was found. It confirms that Mesha, King Mesha, was a historical figure. He was the king of Moab. It mentions Omri, so it demonstrates Omri was actually a historical figure. He wasn't just a figure of myth. It tells us that Mesha revolted in about the time of Ahab, so it proves that was a historical event. And also, interestingly, it is one of the only two references to the house of David outside the Bible, which demonstrates for us that David and the house of David were actually historical entities. Again, they weren't just Jewish myth, which many people thought, because there isn't a lot of archaeological evidence for the reign of David. And it adds a little bit of extra information that Mesha was put under tribute probably by Omri, who was Ahab's father. So we've got broad agreement, but it's not perfect in every detail. So Mesha says absolutely nothing about being defeated by the Jews. He says nothing about sacrificing his son, but would we expect him to? You know, what does Mesha want to leave to posterity? Good news. He doesn't want to leave a bad news story. And he's not alone in that. Plenty of other historians have done the same thing. But what it does tell us is that he puts a lot of store in what Chemosh thinks of Moab. So the reason why Mesha had his setbacks was because Chemosh was angry. So that explains for us why when he finds himself in a position where he's under siege and about to lose the city, he sacrifices his son to Chemosh to try and appease Chemosh. So it really tells us quite a lot, doesn't it? And it's a story from the other side of the fence that corroborates or supports part of the Bible. So let's move forward again, a couple of hundred years, to about 600 to 500 BC. Now I'm deliberately picking examples that will take us step by step through the Bible and give us independent corroboration or support for the biblical record. We're going to move forward now to the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, to Mesopotamia, where we were before with the Sumerians, but more precisely to the archives of the British Museum. You might think they're dark places. You know, you need a torch and you need a duster to dust off all the cobwebs and everything. Not like that at all. It would be a pristine, temperature-controlled environment with all these cuneiform tablets and cylinders and things. Here's a few of them. You can see they come in a wide variety of shapes. We've got prisms, cylinders, little disc-shaped things. They'll all be away in these little drawers on mylar or something. So that's where we want to go. The British Museum has 130,000 cuneiform tablets, which is only a small proportion of the number in the world, believed to be up to 2 million cuneiform tablets. So we're actually looking at a vast historical resource. Many opportunities to find independent support for the Bible. And as these things are being translated, they're finding it. So, you know, there's commercial records, there's receipts for beer. They had beer in Mesopotamia, and bread. There's school practice tablets. That's what this one is here. That hasn't been licked by a dog. You can see it's still there. But the kids would practice their cuneiform on a little bit of clay like that, and wipe it off and start again. That one must have got burnt and hardened, and that's how come we've still got it. So abundant as well as historical records, some of them very, very boring. You know, for the most boring history you'll ever read. So, you know, in the year 2000 BC, King so-and-so came to the throne and killed someone else and then had a battle and then someone else came on, like that. But very good because it corroborates the Bible. Now, one of the most famous you can probably recognise. Anyone recognise a famous one? The Taylor, yep, Sennacherib's prison, the Taylor prison over here. That one, which will be in your handout, which I hope you've all got. I'm not going to talk about it. I think Uncle Dave Saul will talk about that later on. That's a record, again, a very boastful record of a king. They did this a lot, the kings. A boastful record of Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem. There's a host of other tablets, prisms, cylinders and so on. Many of them obtained from antiquities dealers, so the museum doesn't even know where they come from half the time. They're just bought from a dealer in the Middle East. And we're just going to have a look at two examples. One relating to the death of Sennacherib. Now, how did Sennacherib die? Can anybody tell me? Sorry? he was killed by his two sons. Exactly. Sennacherib was killed by his two sons. Let's just have a look at the record. 2 Kings chapter 19. Verse 36. And this is after the siege that's recorded on Taylor Prison. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch, his god, that Adramelech and Sharezer, his son, smote him with the sword and escaped into the land of Armenia. And Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his stead. So Esarhaddon was the next king. Sennacherib was bumped off by his two sons. And there's quite a long story. We could go through many cuneiform tablets that talk about the circumstances around Sennacherib's death. And the job of historians is to piece together all these little fragments of information to try and build up a picture of what really happened. We're just going to take a look at one, and the next couple, this example and the next one, is just to demonstrate the accuracy of the Bible. So this is excitingly called the ABC1 tablet, right? Because they're dealing with hundreds of tablets. They don't even know where they come from, so they just label them with names like that. There's ABC5, surprise, surprise, and probably 2 and 3 and 4. But ABC1 says this: on the 20th day of the month Tebu, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, was killed by his son in a rebellion. For 24 years Sennacherib ruled Assyria. On the 18th day of the month Adaru, Esarhaddon, his son, ascended to the throne in Assyria. So again, just a small little point, but a corroboration of a little detail in the Bible. How did Sennacherib die? There we've got a little corroboration of what it was. Again, the detail doesn't agree exactly, because this one says one son killed him, and the Bible says two sons killed him. The Bible's right, this one is not exactly right. Or perhaps one son actually stabbed him, and the other son was standing by or held onto him, who knows. Now another example, just to demonstrate the accuracy, because there's just so much historical evidence about the Mesopotamians that what we're actually looking at here is accuracy. So who was the last king of Babylon? Oops. Who was the last king of Babylon? Well, might as well just say now, mightn't I? It was Belshazzar, and we know that from Daniel chapter 5, verse 30. Now, historians are a little bit like scientists, right? They think they're very clever, they do a lot of study, and they compare text with text and write very long articles in university journals, and they say this is fact, you know. What we've written and what we've studied, this is the latest scholarly research. So, after all their research, they said this is wrong. Right? Belshazzar wasn't the last king of the Babylonians. The last king of the Babylonians was a chappie called Nabonidus. He was the last king because we've done all this research. We can find no reference to Belshazzar. Nabonidus is the last king. So, that was believed up until about 1854, there's no reference at all of Belshazzar, until someone found this. This is Nabonidus cylinder from Ur. You can pronounce it yourself now because you can see it up there. And this is what it said. As for me, Nabonidus, king of Babylon, save me from sinning against your great Godhead and grant me as a present a life long of days. And as for Belshazzar, the eldest son, my offspring, instill reverence for your great Godhead in his heart. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, but what it does tell us is that Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus. Now let's have a look at another one. This one wasn't translated until 1924. This is called the verse account of Nabonidus. No need to know why it's called that or too much about what's on it, except that it says this: Nabonidus entrusted the camp, in other words the city, to his oldest son, the firstborn, and bracketed Belshazzar, because we know that his firstborn was Belshazzar from the little cylinder before. The troops everywhere in the country he ordered under his command. He let everything go and trusted the kingship to him, and himself, he, Nabonidus, started out for a long journey. The military forces of Akkad marching with him, he turned towards Tema in the west. So what's this telling us? It's telling us that at some point in time, Nabonidus collected his army and disappeared off into the west, to a place called Tema. And he left in charge Belshazzar. So in 1924, when they translated this, after for many years maintaining that Daniel was wrong, scholars had to actually do a backflip and say, well, actually, we had it wrong. And I bet you the evolutionists might say the same thing if we're around for another couple of hundred years. So maybe their scholarship wasn't as good as what they thought it was. Clearly it wasn't, because as more evidence came to light and they got a fuller picture, they realised Belshazzar actually was the last king of Babylon. Okay, now let's move to the New Testament. So we've taken a few snapshots, very, very early ones, about the flood, the kings. Now we've looked at Mesopotamia, Babylon. Now let's come to the New Testament. And when we get to the New Testament, we come to a period where there's a huge amount of historical sources. The Romans and the Greeks, particularly the Romans in the New Testament, were very, very literate people. And there's Latin's still a study in some of those snobby private schools in England and possibly here. I mean, there may be some brothers and sisters in this ecclesia who studied Latin. There's people laughing over there. Rach is laughing. She probably studied Latin. Did you, Rach? No? So, highly literate people, the Romans, and produced an abundant, huge amount of historical material. There's absolutely no question, I won't bother going through this, but there's absolutely no question that the major events and the major politicians referred to in the Bible, people like Augustus, Pilate, Herod, are all historical figures. There's absolutely no doubt about it. The interesting question, though, is whether the history, this non-biblical history, supports the existence of some of the key characters in the Bible. Jesus and the apostles. Is there any mention of Jesus and his apostles and some of those key characters and some of those key events like the crucifixion? Are there any references to those in non-biblical sources? That's the interesting question. And the answer to that is yes. I want to give you a couple of examples. You've got an example in your handout from the Roman historian Tacitus, but I'm actually going to give you a couple of examples from the works of Josephus. There's Josephus on the right, and on the left you can see a very early manuscript of one of Josephus's works, the Antiquities of the Jews. That manuscript dates to 1466. And a lot of these manuscripts were actually transferred and copied by monks in monasteries as practice, so a way of practicing their Latin. And the only reason we've got a lot of these ancient historical sources is because people like Charlemagne got his monks on the job, copying them in order to improve their grammar and spelling. So we've got a whole stack of these ancient manuscripts copied by monks, which did create a few problems, as we'll see in a moment. But Josephus, who was he? Jewish historian, born in AD 37. So he was born just 7 years, actually about 4 years, after the death of Christ. Christ was in his living memory, well, not his living memory, but the living memory of his father and the people around him. Josephus was a Pharisee. He was also a general who fought in the Jewish revolt. He was a bit of a slippery, slimy sort of a character, because when the battle went against them, the guys he was with formed a suicide pact. They were going to do a masada, stab each other, and Josephus managed to weasel his way out of that, ended up being the only one left alive. I suppose he was the last one with the sword and he was supposed to fall on it, and he said, well, no one's going to know if I don't. He'd always sympathised somewhat with the Romans, so being the sort of slippery, slimy character he was, he made friends with the general Titus, who was the general in charge of the Roman army fighting against Jerusalem. And Titus later became the emperor. So that was a pretty good move on the part of Josephus. He got pensioned off to Rome in AD 70 and was given a villa to live in. So he did very well for himself. Managed to change sides and end up being given a villa in Rome. What more could you want? Where he retired to a life of writing. Wrote 2 major histories, the Jewish Wars, which was published in about 75 AD, and Antiquities of the Jews, 93 AD. Now, how interesting is that? These histories are written when apostles are still alive. Right? This is the very early days of Christianity. Josephus lived in the milieu, the times and the place of the apostles when the apostles were going forth preaching. He was a boy, child, and certainly he would have known a lot of the events going on. So what does he say about these events? I'll give you 3 examples from his Antiquities that refers to Jesus and John the Baptist and James, the brother of John. Now, the most famous of these is, can anyone read what that title is? Testimonium Flavianum. It just means the testimony of Josephus. So I'll read it out for you. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. He was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people who accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him, be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the 3rd day he appeared to them, restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvellous things about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. So that's pretty amazing, isn't it? In fact, you might say a little too good to be true. And you'd be right. As you can imagine, there's been a mountain of scholarship about that text. And a good deal of dispute. There's people that say the entire thing was added in by priests, who, as I said before, that's how we've got these things, because they were copied by priests, and the priests thought, oh, here's a good opportunity, I'll write in a bit of extra. And there are scholars who actually believe the whole thing's authentic. But probably the majority say that the core of that statement is authentic and there have been little bits added in. Would you like to guess which little bits have been added in? What about the bit that says he was the Messiah? Now, Josephus was a Pharisee. Do you really think he'd say Christ, Jesus was the Messiah? I think not. So let's just delete the sections that most scholars believe have been interpolated or added. Now let's read that. It's still quite a remarkable passage. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats. So it was well known that Christ had done amazing things like miracles. He was a teacher of such people who accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified, and we have independent verification, Jesus lived, he did amazing things, he was crucified. Those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him, and the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. So that's after the critics have had a go at it. That's still a pretty amazing testimony to the existence of Christ, I think. Now I want to have a look at a couple of others in the time that we've got left that most critics say are authentic. So even the critics say these are authentic. So let's just take a look at this. So, as I say, unlike the previous one, most people say this is authentic. Josephus says, Ananus, the high priest, convened the judges of the Sanhedrin, brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus. We know this James, he wrote the Epistle of James, who was called the Christ. So verification that many people believe Jesus to be Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. Now many of you be thinking about the Acts record where James was killed by Herod. This is not referring to that. It's referring to a later event. This is talking about the writer of the Epistle of James, who was the brother of Christ. And what it does tell us is that James, this is how James met his end. He was accused, brought before the Sanhedrin and stoned to death. So, very interesting. Interesting because virtually all the scholars believe that this section of Josephus is authentic, wasn't added in. Finally, our last reference tonight, Josephus refers to the death of John the Baptist. Again, most scholars believe this is correct. This is authentic and not being added in. This is even critical scholars, ones that don't believe the Bible and who would love to say this is proven to be incorrect. But to some of the Jews, the destruction of Herod's army, because Herod Antipas went to war against Petra and was defeated, to some of the Jews, the destruction of Herod's army seemed to be divine vengeance, and certainly a just vengeance, for his treatment of John, surnamed the Baptist. For Herod had put him to death, though he was a good man and had exhorted the Jews to lead righteous lives, to practice justice towards their fellows and piety towards God, and so doing to join in baptism. He goes on in more detail than that. You can have a read of that yourself sometime if you've got that version of Josephus that many of us have got. What does that prove for us? John the Baptist lived. He was a historical figure. He baptised people and he taught them to repent of their ways. Again, quite an amazing independent verification of the Bible. So, what I've done deliberately, I've given you a lot of material tonight, but I think it's the sheer bulk of the material that demonstrates for us how unique the Bible is as a history book. I don't think you'd find another history book that covered such a vast period of time that's independently verified at so many different points. You think of it. We first had a look at Sumer, 1,700 years before Christ, talking about the flood, an event that happened long before that. So many similarities we saw. Mereneptah Steely down in Egypt, 1200 BC, referring to Israel as a nomadic people, at roughly the time we believe they were engaged in the Exodus, wandering in the wilderness. The Moabite Stone, Mesh's Steely, 840 BC from the time of the kings. Really good independent verification of a story in the Kings, of the revolt of Mesha against Israel. Babylon, the verse account Nabonidus, and ABC 1. I haven't got a picture of ABC 1, couldn't find one anywhere. Okay, talking about the death of Sennacherib, talking about proving that Belshazzar was the last king of Babylon. And we could have found many, many more tablets that independently verify what the Word of God says. And there's a couple or other examples in your handout. And finally, Josephus. It gave us 3 different independent verifications of the Gospel records. So quite amazing, I think, independent historical evidence supporting the writing in the Bible. So to conclude, tonight we've looked at quite a vast period of history. We've looked at 4 different nations, Sumer, Babylon, Moab, Egypt and Rome. Different civilisations, different historical records over a wide period of time. And although those records come from such a diversity of sources, there's an amazing amount, I think you would agree, amazing amount of agreement with the biblical record, giving the limitations of man-made history, which, as I said before, is inherently inaccurate. And I think it proves how unique and special the Bible is as a history book. There's no other book, as I said before, from the ancient world that covers such a vast breadth of time in such detail and with such reliability. And for me, that's strong evidence that the Bible is inspired.